Welcome to another episode of the Content Jefe Podcast, where we dive into the world of digital content creation and content marketing. I'm your host, Studio Steve, and today we're tackling a question that's on the minds of many aspiring and current podcasters. To video or not to video? That is the question. In this digital age where content is king, the decision between starting an audio-only podcast or venturing into the visually engaging world of video podcasting can be a hard one. And whether you're just starting out or you're considering a transition from audio to video, this episode is tailored just for you. And joining us today is Veronica from the Pod Sound School, a renowned expert in marketing and podcasting who has successfully navigated the realms of both audio and video podcasting. And she's here to shed the light on the pros and cons of each format, share some insights on making the transition, and maybe help demystify the world of video podcasting. So whether you're jotting down notes for your future podcast or contemplating upgrading your current one, this conversation is one you will not want to miss. Let's dive in.
Pod Sound School presents Content Jefe, the podcast that helps online business owners make better content and more money. Let's Jefe up.
First off, Veronica, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
For our listeners who are new to this or who may kind of need a little clarification, can you explain what video podcasting is, how it's different from traditional audio podcasting?
Traditional audio podcasting is what we've been listening on the podcast platforms. It's audio only narrative type of content. Video podcasting, on the other hand, requires the video component. You have the audio and you have the video, and it's a very good way to make content these days because you can leverage the power of both formats. A few years ago, when you would say podcasting, it would encompass only audio content. But now when you say podcasting, that may encompass all sorts of different ways to make content, which can be only audio or audio and video, vertical videos, horizontal videos. There's blurred line between audio only and video podcasting and different formats and different platforms. A lot of people may argue that the vertical videos that you see on social media with people talking into the microphone, that's podcasting. That was a long answer for your question. But
No, I love that because we're just so in the weeds with this, and there's kind of this maybe back and forth argument. You hear maybe people get precious about it in the industry. I know that some people will claim what it is to even have a podcast is to have an RSS feed. And for those of you who don't know, an RSS feed is basically a technology that allows you to upload all of your files to a hosting site. And then there's a link to those files that gets shared to the podcast directory. So the podcast directories don't actually have to hold or house your files. That's done through this kind of redirecting link magic, right? And so that's kind of cool maybe from Apple's standpoint, because they don't have to hold all of these files. And there's a bunch of podcast hosting companies that are responsible for holding your files. But that's also kind of what makes podcasting maybe complicated. I know that approach when you're first getting into podcasting can be complicated. And so maybe some people are thinking about just ditching that whole aspect of podcasting in general and just going all in on YouTube. And now YouTube has made a lot of advancements in podcasting. They hired a head of podcasting. They have a podcast tab page now. YouTube podcasts are now being directed to YouTube Music. You mentioned the lines are getting blurred. Why don't we just say that it's all semantics? If you're going to be precious about what a podcast is and what a podcast isn't, is there any other qualities that you would use to define what somebody says when they say, I want to start a podcast? And what's the difference between me saying, I want to start a podcast and I want to start a YouTube channel?
When we are coaching people how to start making content and they send me an email or they send me a DM on Instagram and they say, I want to start a podcast, I just don't say, okay, let's do it. I want to have a conversation with that person to really get to the bottom of what they want. Because once you have that meeting and you ask questions, sometimes that's not what they want, or that's what they want, but they want it in a different way. For example, I met with a prospect the other day and he said that he wanted a podcast. At the end of the conversation, he was convinced that he wanted a video podcast because he wanted to start posting content on YouTube. So it's not about getting attached to certain ideas or to certain formats. It's about delivering what people are gravitating towards these days, and also the content that you feel comfortable making, instead of just being so precious about definitions, how things should be a certain way. Is what your audience wants from you and what you feel the calling to make. It can be video podcasting, it can be audio only that you upload to a web host and distribute it via RSS. It can be video podcasting that you take the audio from it and you do the same distribution through the RSS feed, and then you upload your video to YouTube, and then you upload your video to Spotify for podcaster. There are many different avenues and routes. And if you are a podcast coach and somebody approaches you and tells you that they want to start a podcast, my advice is just to look further into what they want. If you want to start a podcast, then I would advise you to get a coach so that person can guide you to make a good decision for the content that you will be making and show you what that entails and what fits your time and your budget and maybe your skills or the desire that you have of making this content.
That's interesting. I like that a lot because it goes into what type of content you want to make and that there's gray area. When I think about big podcasts like the Mel Robbins Show, for example, what makes Mel Robbins' podcast not just the Mel Robbins YouTube channel, or the Diary of a CEO, very big on YouTube, but it's a podcast on YouTube? Is it the presence of a podcast microphone? Is it the interview? Is it the way that you're structuring the conversation? Why, if Mel Robbins instead was doing more of a talking head approach and just deciding to do informative, kind of entertaining style videos? So we have these radio conventions and broadcast conventions of people being really close to a microphone and talking like this. And that's what we're kind of thinking is podcasting. And even if it is video podcasting, could probably argue that a good portion of the video podcast audience are also listening, and the listening component of those videos, and especially the conversational or more of the longer format style that we're used to, requires a different type of patience. It requires a different type of investment of your time. And when I watch video podcasts, I look away quite a bit. And I'm even more okay with it just kind of being on my phone off in the background. And maybe if someone makes a funny comment or if they laugh or something, that draws me to actually look at the video for a moment. So maybe it's just this difference in consumption.
As a creator, you have to make those decisions early on when you are planning the content that you will be making, because if you want to leverage the power of podcasting in your developing stage, you decide that your channels, your brand, the way that you make the content, the way that you edit the content, the topics, the format, all of that then will be centered on what a podcast is. Using your example, Mel Robbins podcast, that's the name of the YouTube channel, the Mel Robbins podcast. And the format that she chose for that type of content that she's making is conversational interview format, long episodes, instead of just shorter videos with information that people consume on YouTube. So when you are planning your content, you need to make those decisions early on of how the way that you build your brand is going to reflect on what you're making and whether you're making a podcast or not. So it has nothing to do with the RSS or the microphone. It has more to do with the format and attaching the word podcast to it. If it's just the Mel Robbins Show, I find that on YouTube, then I would assume that it's not a podcast. That is just a talk show. But because it says the Mel Robbins podcast, then we know that it's a podcast. That was her intention. And also because of the format of the content itself, it's conversational interview format. And also because you can find it in audio form and in video form. I think that that's my commentary to what you were saying, because it wasn't a question.
I liked it though. I think that gives me some clarity on basically the definitions. As that first, the definitions don't matter. But second, it is about when you are attaching the word podcast to the end of your content, you are suggesting and telling your audience that you intend on being consistent, that you intend on either interviewing or having more like in-depth exploration of topics, if it's going to be educational, or it's going to be entertaining, talk show style, radio show style, in any number of formats. We could go on and on and on, and it's all just semantics and words, and it doesn't really matter. So if you're approaching podcasting or you've been podcasting for a while, and you really just kind of think that you're in this old school thought of just thinking, you know what, I know that my audience just listens to me. I have a good listener base. Speaking of Mel Robbins, I know that a good portion of her audience just listens to her in the car or in their AirPods when they're exercising. Podcasts aren't really made to be watched, and all these video podcasting people are dumb. Convince me otherwise. Convince me of why should I bother video podcasting? What's it going to do for me?
Thinking this way is going to limit your reach. When you are creating content in different formats, that opens the door for you to captivate audiences on other platforms. If you make audio only content, that limits you to be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and the other podcast players, and you are ignoring millions and millions of people who are on YouTube, or millions and millions of people who are on Instagram or TikTok that may never be interested in listening to your show, but they may be interested in watching the video or watching a portion of the video, or maybe watching a 60-second clip with some nugget of wisdom that you recorded on your podcast instead of listening to the audio only. It's all about expose your content to different audiences on different formats for your benefit, because ultimately the reason why you're making content is because you want to have an audience. So it doesn't matter if it's audio, if it's video, if I listen to it, or if I play it on YouTube as a video and then I just plug my headphones and start cleaning my house. And am I watching? Am I listening? It does not matter. And if you have the thought of starting a video podcast and you're blocking yourself from doing it, just think for a second that if you are thinking about it, is because you should be doing it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be something that you will be going back and forth. So I would say if you want to introduce video to your podcast production, I don't think you should wait. I think you should try it. And I think you should open yourself up to new ideas and new ways of making content. Now we have this thing with AI and there's a lot of resistance when it comes to AI. We just need to evolve with what's going on in the content marketing and the content creator industry, because it's an industry that is relatively new. And now we have all of these services and ways to make content, all of this cool software. And we have the script. We're recording here on Squadcast, who's part of the script, and all of these really cool tools that can make your content creation efficient. And why not just be on different platforms if it doesn't entail more time for you or investment of more money or hiring more people? If you can squeeze it into your workflow, just go for it and try it.
I like that a lot. And I think that if I were even more stubborn and you were my coach, you would be peeling away layers of the onion to expose what's really going on, right? And that can be all of the insecurities and everything of actually being on camera. It adds an extra stress, extra worries and concerns. And obviously, too, it does add extra work and extra equipment and extra budget that you need for that equipment. And just to finalize this and bring it all together, you say widen my reach and get the content in front of more people. As a coach, advise that if I'm going to have a podcast on YouTube, that there should be a camera element, that your face should be there, that it's always going to be more advisable to have that versus an audiogram or an audio-only version playing on YouTube. And that's just because of the nature of the YouTube. So it's about understanding what platform your podcast is going to be on. So the first box maybe, or the first reason you're telling me, just to kind of sum this together, why you should have a video podcast, why you should be incorporating a camera into your workflow, is one, for YouTube. That's a big one. And then the other one that we could unpack a little bit is repurposing. So if I already am looking at you, looking at me, if you're just listening to this podcast, we have 2 podcast microphones. Both of us were looking at a camera directly at our computer. I mean, what you would imagine, right, for a podcast. This is what we would be doing anyway, because we're already in a virtual solution many times now. with our guest. So even though it's an audio only podcast, I see my guest face, you see me. It's not really that crazy to think about us just pressing record on our cameras, even if we're just using the camera on our laptops. So, what are the benefits of repurposing, and how could I repurpose my podcast episode? And what does that even mean, repurposing?
To repurpose is to take a piece of your content and extract pieces from it that will go on different platforms. In this case, it will be social media. And you have to be smart about the way that you repurpose, because sometimes it may hurt your brand more than helping you grow on other platforms. One of the things that I recommend is when you are planning your content, your long format interview, or maybe your solo episode, think about the ways that you want to repurpose that content. Because if you start planning your content that way, then when it's time for you to record it, you will have that in mind, and you will know which pieces of that content you want to repurpose into vertical videos for other platforms. The reason for this is because you don't want to post something with ideas that are incompleted. We've been experimenting with this a lot, and there's a process that we use to repurpose our long format episodes for Content Jefe. Our editors do this for us. And they add transitions and they add emojis and those animated captions that capture the attention of people on social media. People on social media have different attention spans than people on YouTube, than podcast listeners. And they're there to be social, to get entertained, and to get tips or information or strategies, or to learn something, but it has to be condensed within 60 seconds or less. So if you're thinking about repurposing your content, you should have all these things in mind. Learn about the platform that you will be posting your repurposing content on. Learn what people favors there, what are some of the things that perform and not perform there as well, and then adapt that piece of content into it. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that was great. I think what it reveals in me is yet something else that you might have to do some coaching with me on, which is I don't think it's laziness, but it kind of feels like it might be just the fact that I am limited in time to begin with, right? And the podcast has been hard to keep it going, to maintain it, to keep the spark alive. I do have some loyal listeners and I'm committed to keep going with this thing. But that all just really added a bunch of stress and a bunch of ideas, because I'm like, okay, so now I have to learn about Instagram. Should I be on Instagram? Should I be on TikTok? What's a way that you would recommend that would be an easier way for me to get started that wouldn't feel so overwhelming? Now I have this podcast episode and you're telling me that I need to go find vertical pieces of it, cut it up, and then add little captions and add little animations. But those vertical pieces have to be really catchy. They have to be little highlights or clips from my episode. And I may or may not find that those perform well on social media. So now I'm going to actually have to log into those social media accounts on a regular basis. And shit, while I'm there, I'm going to start getting all this dopamine without effort, and my brain will be so wired for addiction by the time I'm done. So is it worth it? And what's an easier way that I can get started? And now you're really just kind of back me back into a corner of wanting to go back to audio podcasting only again. I was convinced and now I'm not convinced anymore.
Okay, here's the thing. You have two ways to do this. You can either outsource all of that, so you don't have to worry about wasting time on social media, getting drawn into things that you don't want to get into.
Ooh, okay. I'm liking
If
the way
you
this sounds.
outsource, then your editor will do all of the editing, will get your content looking nice. They will also look for those short that will perform well on the platforms, or you can give your editor instructions, hey, in minute number 10 or something like that, I talked about, let's say I'm a fitness coach and I talked about my pre-workout meal, and you know that will perform well, or maybe you have the sense that people are looking for this information. So just you give your editor instructions, and then you can have a content distributor, and that person can take that content and upload your podcast episode to your web host. They can do all the uploading on YouTube, all the uploading on Spotify, if you are on Spotify for podcasters, with all the titles, the thumbnails, the descriptions, the show notes, and all that. And then they can also post your vertical videos to Instagram, TikTok, or LinkedIn, or whatever is your social media platform of choice.
Hey, I wanted to interrupt this episode to give a big shout out to our Podcast Edit Lab editor, Jill Ludlow, who edited this amazing video podcast episode for you. If you'd like to find out more about how you can work with Jill, go to podsoundschool.com and you can find a list of our certified editors.
If you have to do this by yourself, if you don't have the means just now to bring those two people into your team, if it was just me, I would use this script. The good thing about this script is that now we are recording on Squadcast. Squadcast is now part of the script. If I record interviews remotely, then I will use Squadcast. And I would get the files and I would edit them on the script. And in the script, I would edit my long format content, my podcast, my video podcast. You don't have to overwhelm yourself with getting vertical videos. 3 vertical videos that you can post on a week, that will be sufficient. The goal here is that you don't want to become an Instagram expert or a LinkedIn expert. The goal is to distribute the content on the platforms so it stays there, so it gets eyes and ears, so you start growing your audience there.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems some people may say, well, this is a waste of time because if you don't have a strategy, if you're not an expert on Instagram, then this isn't going to work. It's not going to help you grow as fast as if you would focus on one platform and just master it and maybe get a coach and maybe get an Instagram expert or TikTok expert. But it will help you grow and it will give you some traction. And it's content that you already have it. So why not use it to be on other platforms? So that's the way that I would do it with this script. That you can get so good at it. You can get fast editing your videos. You can also get very fast at just finding those moments where you can get your vertical videos and add some captions. Just keep it very simple.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you batch record, the more you plan ahead, the more organized you will be and the more efficient you will be. So recording your podcast, recording your videos, and posting all that content doesn't become a manageable monster that takes you days for you to complete. And leverage the tools that are out there to save you time. Use ChatGPT now with all of the new updates for the transcripts and again, help you with the summaries. And the script also generates summaries for show notes for your podcast. So
yes, it actually suggests those moments that you could turn into clips, and it will give you the timestamps. And it'll say, these are of particular interest. Like you said with ChatGPT, there's all sorts of crazy things people are doing because you could put the transcript in ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT to find the places in your script where you were most sensational or you targeted certain keywords. I like this. Now you got me moving in the right direction. So listener and or watcher or the combo of both, you're going to need to stay tuned because we're going to have to move into part 2. This first compelling episode with Veronica was really all about convincing you that yes, video podcasting is going to be in your benefit. If you are just getting into podcasting, just dive right in and do both. Get the video. The sooner you get the video there, the better. Also, repurposing doesn't have to be difficult. 1 or 2 pieces of extra content off of each episode, 1 platform. Keep it simple. Use these simplified tools that we have. Train yourself just a little bit and you can get fast. And then number 3, to summarize from this episode, is outsource. Outsource. That's my favorite. And now, don't waste any time and hop into the next episode where we're going to cover part 2 of this riveting video podcast series with Veronica, where we're going to cover how to actually get started video podcasting with specific tips and tricks, with gear, with content ideas and strategies that you can put to use to grow and to attract more listeners and viewers to your podcast.
I'm excited.